Welcome to the final day of WILPF's 35th, WILPF U.S. Section's 35th Triennial Congress. Some of us met during opening day, but for our friends that came in later, my name is Dee Murphy, and I am the coordinator for this year's Congress. How very informative and encouraging this Congress has been. And it's been so busy that I hope to actually be able to see it once it's posted on YouTube. Action joke there. I'd like to extend an apology to members who were exposed to materials on a more serious note, after the day's events were over yesterday. That is in direct contrast, in my opinion, to what we are trying to do towards working for peace from a feminist lens. In 2022, I founded a committee called DPAL, acronym for Domestic Prisoners of War. Our primary goal is to change how we view here in WILPF. Our primary goal is to change how we view one another in society and advocate for measures that protect us all, especially in the one place where we are all supposed to be surrounded by people and things we love, and safety and security. Our motto, coined by Margot Schulter, is peace begins at home. I will venture to say that one of the keys to peace is in how we view one another and ourselves. There are industries, including the music industry, that would like to shape our perceptions of ourselves and of one another, and want us to believe that others are as they portray them, because that's all that some of us know about one another due to lack of daily exposure to people who do not even closely resemble the portraits that are painted of us. When it comes to matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are people that live and breathe this universal egalitarian way of life, not just talk about it, they live it. And then there are those that, just keep trying, and that's a good thing. So one day it will all click. I'd like to give a special thank you to a couple of people who, without their full understanding of this way of life, it would have been 10 times as hard to come together in this Congress without. I begin with April Knutson from Minnesota branch of WILPF, who steadily encouraged and stood by me as I navigated cultural and communication issues with those who did not yet grasp this. Nancy Price, who was so delicately and graciously, and she's our program chair, she delicately and graciously intervened when others with their own ideas about how this Congress should be mapped out almost took us off course. And yes, these are water references. And yes, we would be very much left adrift without her. Dasa Zepps, my fellow Aries sister, who was the cement that we all needed as we came closer and closer to landing. I cannot say enough good things about Dasa in this short time, but we met 7 years ago, and she will continue to hear about this for the next 7 years. And Ellen Schwartz, the voice of reason that steadily and quietly made herself available to support not only Dasa with her 8 arms in tech, but also to lend other forms of support and kept us from throwing one another overboard when we encountered choppy waters. And with that, I will open for Cee Cee Anderson, who is our board member, Personnel Committee Chair, and she will give us all a land acknowledgement, followed by Martha Collins, another board member, who will also introduce herself and give a welcome. Thank you very much.
And we are on as the territories of the indigenous people. But we know deep in our beings that it is very important not only to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of the land settled on, but as to divert and support our indigenous siblings in their movements for self-determination and land back. It's about honoring the past, gratefully recognizing present leaders in the community, and working together in the future with joy and resolve. Further, the Honor Native Land campaign is an assertion that we are all connected to the earth, the water, the air, the cosmos, and to each other. Our destinies are intertwined in this moment of change as we promote and create change that honors all living beings. As we will remember, the indigenous wisdom has taught us thousands of the years that relationships with one another in the community, relationships with all nature, are all really what's being well-being in our life. We honor those teachings as we celebrate and work for peace and justice. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Martha Collins. I am WILPF's Development Committee co-chair, and I welcome each and every one of you all today on the 5th day of the 2024 Congress. As stated in this morning's reminder email, a few of you may just be joining us today, or some of you may just be showing off your grit, your stamina, and your Zoom power by being here for day 5. Either group you're in, thank you. Your attendance is greatly appreciated and needed. For today, I'm just going
Are you there, Martha? Looks like she's frozen. Martha is our member development on our member development committee, and she's co-chair with Mary Beth Gardam and does amazing work both inside and outside of WILPF. I was really looking forward to her opening. Hopefully she comes back and we can move forward, because I know that she's also going to outline some of what's to come. Mary Beth, did you want to say anything to the membership? I see you there. As Martha gets that straightened out.
Well, first of all, Martha is the co-chair of the development committee, the fundraising committee, not member development, just to clear up that confusion. And I can tell you what I'm looking forward to this during today. We'll hear in just a little while from Laura Dewey about an exciting opportunity for WILPF in the next 2 years. We'll hear later on from Osprey Orielle Lake about the struggles of Indigenous women working all around the world on to protect water and climate and the earth. Osprey is an amazing speaker. She was on one of our earlier One WILPF calls, and she represents Indigenous activists who are literally putting their lives on the line around the globe. We'll also hear from, Martha is rejoining the meeting.
Martha's back.
Yay.
I don't know what just happened. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And I don't know what has already been highlighted. I missed those show of hands, but I'm sure you all popped your hands up virtually or in person to show your excitement, and you won't want to miss Laura's presentation just directly after this. It sounds like Mary Beth was introducing our 1 o'clock, and all these times are Eastern time. 1 p.m. It sounded like she was introducing when I came back. Vicki Elson and her partner in life, Timmon Wallis, will talk to us about advocacy, changing the system by expounding on the Warheads to Windmills initiative. They will tell us how feeding 2 birds with 1 scone makes a whole lot of sense. At 2 p.m., we are extremely pleased to bring you a thought leader and activist. You will be glad to know the founder and executive director of Women's Earth and Climate Action Network International will speak about COP28 as easily as she can lift up feminist Indigenous leaders worldwide. 3 p.m. Eastern time, we will hear from our very own Teresa Elamine, who is the chair for the Advancing Human Rights Issue Committee, and will remind us of how racism inflicts all aspects of human life, even basic human right of water. 4 p.m. Women, Money, Democracy Issue Committee offers us enlightening discussions about the financialization of water by our longtime partner and member Ricky Diamond. 5 p.m. Eastern, there will be a follow That will be followed up by a conversation that Mary Sanderson and Fernando Luca will talk about the monetary reform that the Alliance for Just Money is working on. 5:45 p.m. Eastern, our very own WILPF U.S. Board President Darien De Lu will be leading the member plenary session. And during that, will be presentations talking about the Commission on the Status of Women reports, including WILPF's local to global account of 2024 regional meetings and a financial snapshot. 7 p.m. Eastern, our cultural break today will be offered by Darien De Lu, the Philadelphia Grannies, and Karuna, who will be leading us in a short Kundalini yoga exercise. 7:15 p.m. Eastern, our final plenary of the Congress is our River of Peace panel, moderated by Tina Shelton, board member and Greater Philadelphia branch member, building on our knowledge of movements that are rising up in the literal transformation of our world. She will be doing this presentation in partnership or co-facilitation with Shara Arman, founder of the School for Humans and Earth. They will help us learn what hope does to our activist work, and Hannah Lee will bring the perspective from Korea Peace Action and Network that is growing and building. Reverend Rita Morgan will bring her perspective in how community and communication build the movements we are creating. And then we will end the night with a treat from the Fresno Grannies at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. And then the conversation rooms will be open for one last time. Thank you all so much again for joining us today. If it's day 1, all the way through day 5. And without further ado, let's get started.
We want to move to the next part of our schedule, which is a presentation by Timmon, Wallis, and Vicki, Elson, titled Feeding Two Birds with One Scone, Taking Action to Address Both Climate Change and Nuclear Weapons.
Well, hello everyone, and thanks for having us join you for this session. Some of you have heard some of this before, and if not, it's all in the book, Warheads to Windmills, Preventing Climate Catastrophe and Nuclear War, which you can get on Amazon or any other place, preferably from a local bookshop. So we're just going to give a short presentation and leave time for questions and discussion about these two existential threats. And we have plenty of things to be worried about right now, but these are up there as among the worst things.
So,
and I'll put the slides on now.
okay, great. So we're not just here to talk about scary stuff. We're here to talk about the good news, the things that we can do. The book is tremendously insightful and detailed and useful and accessible. And we are just really grateful that you're willing to talk about this stuff, because a lot of people don't like to talk about it.
And Vicki is going to be sharing some of her experiences about trying to talk to the people who are responsible for the mess that we're in right now, especially the corporate executives from some of the biggest nuclear weapons contractors and their minions in Congress.
Okay.
So, in a nutshell, we're talking about climate and nuclear weapons, and as two of many threats to the world, but two very serious ones that threaten all of us and the whole planet, and about the fact that the money and the jobs released from one of these threats could be used to solve the other, which seems like a no-brainer, but that's where we are. And neither of these can be solved without working together with Russia and China and Europe. And so we're facing the challenges of solving either of these crises without building a more cooperative global climate. And they both require urgent, bold, radical action. We're talking about eliminating nuclear weapons, eliminating the burning of fossil fuels, and no more baby steps to get us to where we're not far enough. And we know that what's preventing this are the corporations, both the fossil fuel corporations and the nuclear weapons corporations. So that's what we're going to be talking about in our presentation. We know that we have the power to pressure those corporations, and we can do this.
So This is a picture of what the future could look like. Global warming takes place over years and decades, but if we don't stop burning fossil fuels now, we're heading for a climate that cannot sustain life as we know it, let alone the East Coast.
And if you follow the doomsday clock, you know that we're getting closer and closer to midnight, with climate scientists telling us the risks about climate, and the nuclear scientists telling us that the risks are just getting worse.
Either way, it's actually the climate that gets us in the end, either too hot or too cold. Whoever survives will be unable to find food. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Breaking news.
Oh,
I'm
I don't know
sorry.
if I can do the stop and go sharing. You'll just have to wave that around a bit.
Okay, well.
We have a prop.
I just got news from the people who do time travel. They figured out how to send artifacts back from the future, and this is something that has appeared along with the this brochure for bunkers and bomb shelters. So this artifact, it appears to be a toilet paper roll, but it has writing on it, and it's very interesting. It says, "Rich people on a dead planet, what were we thinking? God damn it."
So we're I think all of you are by now familiar with the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has been our inspiration. And one of the things that set me going on the book is the fact that these two issues are linked. This is just one example. I mean, I have a lot of detail in the book, but this is one example of the kind of money we need collectively, globally, to address the climate crisis. It's not unlimited amounts of money, but it's also not a small amount of money. And when we look at the cost of nuclear weapons, it's very similar. Over the next 10 years, as you can see here, that's down at the bottom, I don't know if you can see it, but over 1 trillion now, just for the next 10 years, and up to 3 trillion for the next 30 years, that's already being earmarked for all these new nuclear weapons. But it's not just the money, it's the jobs. These are some of the jobs in the nuclear weapons industry, scattered around the country. And we need those people, we need the scientists, the engineers, the brain power to actually be working on all the challenges that still are facing us with regard to batteries and storage and transmission and electrification, vehicles, electric planes, and all the rest of it. So we also know that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we need cooperation. These are the 5 biggest emitters of carbon. There are many other, there's almost 200 countries in the world, but the top 5 emit more than half of all the carbon in the world. So we have to work together to make any real dent on carbon emissions. And those are the same countries, pretty much, that are pointing nuclear weapons at each other. So unless we tackle both of these issues together, we're not getting where we need to get.
So as you know, that's why we are working on feeding 2 birds with 1 scone, abolishing fossil fuels, abolishing nuclear weapons, not just taking small steps that reduce the dangers.
And we start off here with our, this is Eleanor Holmes Norton. I think most of you know her. She's the member of Congress for Washington, D.C., and her bill, H.R. 2775, is our nuclear weapons, is our Warheads to Windmills bill. It's been sponsored by WILPF over many decades now, since the 90s, and that's what we're trying to get passed in Congress. But as we know, it's a challenge, and part of that is understanding the difference between signing and ratifying a treaty. So you all know that the Norton bill calls on the U.S. president to sign the Nuclear Ban Treaty. That gives us plenty of time to negotiate with other nuclear countries before ratifying the treaty and actually beginning the disarmament process. And that's a very important distinction.
So if you want to know where the problem comes from and how to fix it, follow the money. Do you know the nearest country with legalized corruption? I'm sure you do. So why is this so difficult?
Yeah, we have the Norton bill. We have our friends in Congress. Many of you have been helping lobby your own representatives and so on. But we know that it's a long shot, very long shots, because of all the corruption from lobbying, from these corporations, from the revolving door, from the financing of elections, but also the control over the media, the money that goes into drip by drip, influencing the way people think about these two issues.
And I saw this with my own eyes. I spent 3 days in a hotel basement near the Pentagon with 530 members of the nuclear weapons industrial complex, White House representatives, government officials, military brass, a couple of members of Congress. I got a press pass to see what they talk about when they're alone. Tim told me that if I went to this event, I would need therapy, and he was correct. It was pretty scary. You can see also there's a picture of the protesters across the street. So the top picture is what the doomsday machine actually looks like. And the protesters, a summit participant stopped by where they were holding their signs and thanked them, not ironically, for expressing themselves nonviolently. So the nutshell about what they talk about, go back please. What they talk about is they talk about the deterrent, which is the mythical effect of having nuclear weapons. They talk about it as if there's no alternative, how the deterrent, so-called, has to be ever more destructive and terrifying. They have a lot of urgency and panic over meeting modernization targets, modernization in quotes, replacing plutonium pits. And these are the couple of things that really worried me the most. One was that they are grateful for the perpetual bipartisan support that they get from Congress, in other words, trillions of dollars, and they're very happy about that. And they also are worried about safety regulations slowing them down on their mission. At the summit, the director of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory said, "We have capability because of our nuclear weapons work. What other challenges can we apply our capabilities to? Climate, environment." So that was a bright spot for me. Her name is Kim Boudil, and we were grateful to hear at least one person saying that conversion could happen. What you see on the screen there is something that we distribute to college students, STEM students, about the choices that they make in life.
So these are the companies, you know them all.
Wait, Tim, something else just came in from the future. It says, "I was so proud of my stock portfolio, Textron, Valero, Chevron, Texaco, Huntington, Ingalls, Phillips 66, Fluor-Leidos, General Dynamics, Airbus, Jacobs, Peraton, Marathon, BAE, BP, RTX, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Rolls-Royce, Honeywell, Koch Brothers, ExxonMobil, L3 Harris, Bechtel, Boeing. Rich people on a dead planet? What were we thinking? God damn it."
So these are the companies, and we know that they are subject to influence, many different influences. And we know that because there's a long history of boycotts and divestment campaigns over the decades with apartheid and many other issues, but also with the nuclear issue. And I'm sure many of you were around in the 1980s when there was the national boycott of General Electric light bulbs. General Electric made light bulbs and they made nuclear weapons, as did many other household companies. And the reason we know that General Electric was influenced, first of all, they pulled out of the nuclear weapons business, so they don't make nuclear weapons anymore. They're not part of that list. But also, if you Google General Electric today and look on their website, Google General Electric nuclear weapons, you will find this page on their website, which explicitly says, we do not manufacture, assemble, sell, or service cluster bombs, landmines, or nuclear weapons. And they say that because they care about the public opinion, and they care about their reputation and their status in the world. And we've got all kinds of tools to put pressure on these companies. This is a map of the nuclear-free zones back in the 1980s, and the big important impact that this had was the cities that were starting to divest and boycott these companies with contracts. So Oakland, California, for example, you know, they have $1 million contracts. It's not just buying a light bulb from General Electric. It's a multi-million-dollar contract for a library or a hospital or a school or a bridge or whatever. And these cities started passing legally binding ordinances banning contracts with the nuclear weapons companies back in the 1980s. And that was one of the big factors in the change that led to the INF treaty and all the results that brought down the end of the Cold War. And this is the form that was used by Oakland, California, and this is still used today. So any company that wants to do business with Oakland, California has to sign this affidavit saying they have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Now, this is a huge form of pressure that we have to put on these companies. And we know they're having pressure.
Well, because they're trying to fight back. Right now, the big oil companies are trying to sue Greenpeace, which sounds like a joke, but it's not, for hundreds of millions of dollars because of their efforts to build opposition to big oil. So that's actually really good news.
And you've probably seen about Oklahoma and some of these other southern states that are actually trying to outlaw the divestment from fossil fuel companies, because they see the impact that this is going to have on these companies, and they're trying to make it illegal, which is obviously not good for the companies, but it shows the impact that these divestment campaigns are and can have. And we know, I don't know if you can see the figure there, but at the moment, over $40 trillion has been pulled out, withheld from the fossil fuel industry, which is a lot of money. The nuclear weapons industry is a bit smaller. About 4 trillion has been withdrawn, mostly in Europe. But here you see New York City, which has committed to divesting its multi-billion-dollar pension funds from nuclear weapons companies. So if New York City can do it, other cities can do it. And this is such a powerful tool that we have.
One of the differences from the 1980s and today is that there are far fewer companies. They've been buying each other up, involved in the nuclear weapons business. In the 1980s, there were a couple hundred to divest from, and they had consumer products that you could boycott. It's a little trickier now. If you want to boycott these companies, it helps if you're a city or a state or a county and you buy big ticket items like airports and infrastructure and things. But there's one really interesting opportunity. If you live near or are involved with a hospital or a hospital system, the same companies that make nuclear weapons also make hospital equipment, partly because both are nuclear in some cases and partly because it's good PR for them. So if we pressure the hospitals into boycotting the companies that make hospital products, that could really have a powerful stigmatization effect.
And it's not just hospitals, but faith communities and other, universities, colleges. As you probably know, the whole student movement about Gaza has been about divesting universities from the same companies that we're talking about in terms of nuclear weapons. I mean, they're the same companies, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and so on, that are making weapons for Israel right now to be used in Gaza. This is our Quaker meeting in Massachusetts, which took a stand to divest, but also to write letters to, in this case, Honeywell again, saying we're not going to buy your thermostats if you keep making nuclear weapons. So
it was a very interesting correspondence. The Quakers said we won't, all they could find that was connected to the nuclear weapons industry was Honeywell thermostats. So they said, we're not going to buy any more thermostats from you, Honeywell, until you stop making nuclear weapons and align with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Honeywell wrote back, their legal department wrote back and said, "We can assure you that our work is in strict compliance with all laws, including the treaty." Quakers wrote back, "We were puzzled. Does the National Security Campus really have nothing to do with nuclear weapons?" Honeywell said, they wrote back again, they said, "Well, yeah, but the US didn't sign the treaty, so we don't consider our work to be non-compliant." The Quakers wrote back, this was such an interesting exchange, "But the US did sign and ratify the 1969 Non-Proliferation Treaty, which commits the US to eliminating nuclear arsenals in good faith and at an early date." And that was 55 years ago. And that was part of a letter writing campaign, that correspondence, where lots of people wrote letters, maybe some of you, to Darius Adamczyk, who was then the chairman and CEO of Honeywell.
And the outcome of that, which is not what we planned, was that Honeywell didn't sell their nuclear weapons division, they sold their thermostat division.
Oh, well,
So
we tried, and we may have made them do that. We don't know for sure. So we know that.
here's Vicki raising hell at Honeywell.
Oh, yeah. I bought a share of stock so I could go to their shareholders meeting, and that's a whole story too. Asking them to convert to green technologies to protect their own business, to keep them profitable in the face of legal risks and legislative risks. So where are we? We're here.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So we know that divestment, boycotts, and stigmatizing these companies can have an impact. We're already seeing that with fossil fuels, but much more is needed there. And we're beginning to see it with nuclear weapons, and a lot more needs to happen there. But in the case of nuclear weapons, we also have a secret weapon, which we talked about already, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the reason why that's our secret weapon is because of this clause, Article 1E, which prohibits the assistance, encouragement, or inducement in any way of anyone to engage in any activity prohibited by the treaty. And that is a clause that's in other treaties. It's been around for a very long time, and we know from other treaties that have been around longer that this clause includes financial, can include the interpretation of prohibiting financial assistance, including divestment, investments, including loans, including doing business with these companies. And this is an important link, because this is the one tool that other countries have to put pressure on these companies that are in the US mostly. So here is a map of the treaty where, I don't know if you can see, but the blue countries have already signed and ratified the treaty. The green ones have signed and are in the process of ratifying. The yellow ones have voted for the treaty but have not yet signed it, and they continue to vote for it every year at the UN, but they still haven't signed it. And the orange ones are countries that have huge public pressure to join the treaty, including members of their parliaments or Congress, and even in the case of Australia, for example, the Prime Minister of Australia is personally committed to getting Australia into the treaty. As you may know, Germany and Spain have coalition governments, and it's written into the coalition agreements in both those countries that they will join the treaty sooner or later. So these are countries that are committed to the treaty, and they're the countries that are also out there where all these nuclear weapons and fossil fuel companies are operating. This is Honeywell operating in 110 countries. They have suppliers, investors, projects, contractors, offices, facilities, and so on in all these other countries. And so the treaty outlawing nuclear weapons and everything to do with nuclear weapons, including financing them in these other countries, is potentially putting an enormous pressure on the companies, not on the US as such, but on the companies that make the weapons. Now, this is a law in Ireland. This is an example of, this is the only one so far, but this is an example of what could be become the norm with the treaty and could put enormous pressure on these companies. This is called the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Act from 2019 in the Republic of Ireland. It prohibits everything to do with nuclear weapons in Ireland, Ireland is the only country that has so far divested itself both from nuclear weapons and from fossil fuels, and has taken steps to make sure that the country doesn't have anything to do with nuclear weapons. But any person in Ireland that is found guilty of any of the prohibitions of this act shall be liable to, if you see there, A, a fine, or B, imprisonment for life, or such lesser term as the court may determine. So Ireland has a law that says you could go to prison for life for having anything to do with nuclear weapons. That is a very, very powerful message to the companies.
So if you're just listening and you can't see the slide, it's a nice picture of a leader saying, "I've decided to step down as your CEO in order to spend more time in prison." So theoretically, an RTX Raytheon executive could go on a golfing vacation in Ireland and never return. This is very powerful enforcement. We're hoping that other countries do the same.
And we have this with the nuclear ban treaty. We don't yet have a fossil fuel treaty. There is a movement for a fossil fuel treaty. We're supporting this and hoping that it will include an assistance clause and will start to put the same kind of pressure on the fossil fuel companies. At the moment, this is a map of the countries that are committed to this treaty. There's 12 of them. You can only see one because the rest are small islands that will disappear with climate change. So they're the ones that are spearheading this and are very committed to a treaty that would phase out the burning of fossil fuels and make it illegal to have anything to do with the burning of fossil fuels.
So while the world is pressuring the companies with enforcing the TPNW, the nuclear ban treaty, and hopefully someday also with a fossil fuel treaty, we can be pressuring the companies with boycotts, divestment, and stigmatization. So pressure coming from internationally, on the left there, treaties, countries, laws, and coming from people, cities and states, institutions with boycotts, divestment, stigmatization. That puts the squeeze on the nuclear weapons companies and the fossil fuel companies. And we are hoping that if they get squeezed enough, what will come out will be a choice to influence governments to help them stay profitable by maybe hopefully switching to greener, cleaner, more peaceful products.
So you see the little dove over in the top right-hand corner there. That's our dream. You know, we want a world. I mean, we don't want just a world without nuclear weapons. We want a world without wars and without, you know, violence and racism and inequality and all the rest of it. But having the dream is not enough. We need to put pressure. And so we have our dove with teeth, which is a dove that has treaties, it has divestment and boycotts and other tools. And if we build a mass movement that can put pressure on these companies, we can get what we want by using our dove with teeth.
We're much more powerful and much more inclusive, multi-generational, intersectional as a coalition. And we want to thank WILPF for your participation in the growing national coalition. If we mix our two great existential crises, the twin threats, together and work on them together, which we think is necessary, then we can really be a lot more effective. So WILPF, thank you so much for being part of this. And also WILPF branches, we would love to have more WILPF branches from across the US join this US coalition.
And our base, so we have the book, Warheads to Windmills, we have a coalition, Warheads to Windmills, and we have a campaign, which is basically, as we've been saying, it's about pressuring the profiteers with boycotts of their products and services, getting cities to refuse contracts with them, divestment, both personal, faith communities, colleges, municipalities, and stigmatizing these companies, shaming them on social media, making them know that we care, writing them letters, contacting the CEOs and going to shareholder meetings like Vicki was describing. That is our strategy for getting rid of fossil fuels and nuclear weapons.
So here's another way to summarize it. We need to pester and put pressure on the predatory profiteers to prioritize people over planetary poisons and let them push powerful politicians to help them pivot to producing more positive products. This has been brought to you by the letter P.
This Vicky's our alliteration department. So we just want to finish. There's time for questions and discussion. You can go to warheads2windmills.org. And if you're not familiar with the Fossil Fuel Treaty, you can join them as well, fossilfueltreaty.org. ICAN, which WILPF is a very important partner in internationally, but you can find out more about them.
And also the fossilfueltreaty.org. So I just want to say again, the figures that you've seen, the numbers and the charts and the graphs, that crunching of data took place at Tim's desk with his team. And he came up with numbers that nobody else has figured out. And this is a tremendously useful book. I think that everybody who cares about the future is going to want to study. The way it's written is, if you want to read 1,000 footnotes, they're there. If you want to read a few pull quotes and highlights, that you can do too. You can flip through it. So, suggesting that you get hold of it if it's something that you think would be useful to you and your team. And it untangles what works most effectively and what doesn't. It looks at false solutions and things that are maybe misguided and things that are really going to make a difference. And so you can have your own copy if you like. And there's also a 32-page full color summary available on the website, warheads2windmills.org, pictures, charts, full color, and it's a briefer summary. What else? I think that's about it. We really want to thank you for participating in this, and we would love to hear your questions. If you want to use the raise hand feature.
Let's ask if there's somebody. Is there somebody
Well, I
facilitating?
see Eileen and somebody else raised their hands.
But is there somebody facilitating the question and answer period, or are we in charge of that? I don't know.
We're happy to let you, but we can help if you'd like.
Okay.
Okay, and I think there's probably questions in the chat as well. So fire away. Let's see.
We can't
Well,
see.
I'm going to start. I'm going to jump ahead of Eileen by saying, please remind us how cheap that booklet is. If people don't want to get the get the big book, I've got both, but the booklet is so handy and it's downloadable for free. Tell us a little bit more, because you've made it really accessible.
Okay, well, the book.
No, she's asking about the little one.
Yeah. So the book looks like that. It's got lots of charts and graphs and stuff, but it's not in color, and it's not as quick a read. This book is what, $16.99.
Yeah. And it's available in other countries too.
This is
$5.
$5, and if you order several, it makes it easier for us to ship them out and package them up, take them to the post office. It is 32 pages, and so if you want a printed copy, let us know. And if you want to just download it in color or however you want, you certainly may. That's for free. We just want to get the word out, get people thinking about these things.
Question in the chat: how do we find the workbook? Where can we get it?
You can get everything at warheads2windmills.org. I had it on the last slide. I can.
Oh yeah, somebody just.
There is. It's in the chat twice now. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let's go to Randy.
And my question was, you were talking about how you were discouraging graduates from working from companies that make nuclear weapons and defense contractors. If I was a graduate and I was offered a big salary, and because we got to pay for these student loans, it might be helpful for you guys to have salaries of non-nuclear companies and non-defense contractors, Because I know if you got a big loan coming out of here, you're going to take the first opportunity to get a career. And if Honeywell is offering you this much money, how could you, Debbie, one of the things you guys might want to look into and say, well, let's dissuade them from doing this, going to here. We can get you a comparable salary and be able to help pay those loans. Because I can't tell you how much a college loan costs because I was still paying on mine. But thanks to the president, I'm not.
Well, we're kind of hoping that people will value survival as much as large amounts of salary. But we're up against some wealthy forces.
Wonderful, thank you. Judy Adams has her hands up, and then Cricket Jane Doyle. And Mary Beth Gardam has some input as well in a chat that she may want to speak to or ask you about as well. So Judy, Cricket, then Mary Beth, and Nancy Price, and Cheryl Spencer.
Hi, this is Judy. Timmon and Vicki, I introduced you at the bookstore, and I just put a note in the chat that I have 2 copies of your book, and of course encourage members to go to Books Inc. Bookstore in Palo Alto in the Town and Country Village Shopping Center. And I'm wondering also, is there a national job listing for jobs in peace so that students and people looking for work could go there and say, well, I could work for Honeywell, but I'd rather work. Is there such a resource?
There are lots of resources. Yeah. I mean, it depends.
Where students could find listings of jobs in peace.
Somebody put idealist.org in the chat. That's
idealist.org. But there's actually a thing.
Oh, good. Okay.
Conflict, Peace, and Development. I can't remember the acronym, but there's a website that's specifically looking for peace jobs. I mean, we're trying to get people to get jobs in the green technologies because we want to solve the climate crisis as well. But there are resources for students for that too. And although, you know, they can't really compete with the salaries and the benefits that some of these companies like Honeywell offer, it is the case that a lot of young people don't want to work for nuclear weapons companies, you know, and they would rather be helping the planet, you know, and we got to just encourage that because we're not going to be able to compete with the salaries when the U.S. is pouring billions and billions of dollars into these companies.
Well, Judy, I want to say it's nice to see you. And I wanted to just tell you something that's a little bit cheerful that I learned when I went to that deterrence summit. They were complaining that, you know, the nuclear weapons jobs are actually under the Department of Energy. All the nuclear weapons money is under the Department of Energy, which is not under the Pentagon. So they were complaining that when the Department of Energy holds a job fair, there's a really, really long line for the table about green jobs and a really, really short line for the table about jobs in nuclear weapons. So I found that heartening. Students are, you know, they're pretty smart.
Thank you. Okay, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. So anyone who's placed a comment in the chat and would like to have their question directly answered, please raise your hand. I will begin, instead of calling out of chat, I will begin going in the order of the hands that I see that are raised. Cricket Jane Doyle, you're next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. This is my chance to do something I've wanted to do for years, which is to thank Vicki for one of my very favorite songs about being an activist called Don't Move to Canada. Since my family's in Canada, I started to learn it thinking, oh, well, I'll sing it for them. And then I realized it was about staying home and being an activist, which I thought was even more wonderful. I encourage you, you can find it on YouTube, and there's a wonderful video that goes with it. The other thing I want to say is a little more serious, but also about your humor. I think that humor is absolutely essential for bringing all of us under the umbrella of this kind of activism. we hear the doom stories so often. We worry about being totally incapable of making any difference. But if you can make people laugh, it kind of, when you laugh, you take a deep breath, and that gives you a little more energy. So thank you both for the humor and for your wonderful song, Don't Move to France. I mean, Don't Move to Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Cricket. That's so nice. If you want to find this song, if you just Google Don't Move to Canada, you find all kinds of things. But it's if you Google Don't Move to Canada song, you might have a better chance. And it's the one that says, don't move to Canada, don't move to France, stay here and fight, stay here and dance. And that was a response to the first election of a person who shall not be named. And we may be needing that song again.
Thank you, Cricket. And Nancy Price has a question.
Well, hi, and thanks so much. This was, I think, quite inspirational, and we should take this forward in wherever our members live and wherever our branches are. So, but I wanted to ask you, I understand from Pat Hines that you're thinking or planning, or you actually are doing a statewide organization in Massachusetts. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that could be a model for other states?
Yeah, we have we put up the slide of the national coalition, but we now also have a Massachusetts one, which has quite a number of local and statewide organizations in it, and we work together on. We have a state bill in Massachusetts to set up a citizens commission to look at this transition from nuclear weapons to green economy, and so that's been a big focus of our state coalition, and we've been trying to set up. I mean, there's a group. I think I forget if Cheryl Spencer maybe is involved in trying to look at one in California. Yeah. There's a group looking at one in New York, and there's already a similar coalition in Pennsylvania called No Wars, No Warming or something, which is bringing together the peace groups and the climate groups. So we're trying to work, at all the different levels.
Yeah, good.
And especially to get some things going at in the state houses, because that's another venue when we can't get anywhere with Congress.
Right. So do you have plans to work now in the fall on the fossil fuel treaty? Because that takes us then into COP29, and COP29 has a huge opportunity to really talk about all the issues of climate, et cetera. So I think there's a window of opportunity there to really work on fossil fuels and link it up to the climate part of the.
Yep.
Yeah, I got to brag about that for a second here.
Yeah.
We were getting ready for the treaty meeting, the meeting of states parties to the nuclear ban treaty, and in
New York.
In New York at the UN. We were getting ready for that, and Tim noticed that the COP28 overlapped on the calendar, and he got it into his head to, well, what if we could talk to each other, the two, the COP28 and the treaty meeting. And he just said that in the kitchen one day, and the next thing I know, I'm next to the UN in this building with the biggest TV screen I've ever seen in my life. And there's people from the COP28 on the screen, and he's organized panelists. Cheryl Spencer was one of those people. I think she might be on here. So he had lined up speakers and panels from both sides, from Dubai to New York and back again. It was very exciting to be there for that historic event.
Great. Good, wonderful. Thank you.
And next, Sheila Harper has a question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your presentation. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Two things. Treaties. Someone during our Congress referenced 10,000 broken treaties. What are we doing to put some teeth in it, to legalize it, to give it some oomph so that does not happen here? That's my first question. Then I have a second follow-up comment. Someone asked about organizations that deal with peace. And I'm wondering whether or not you can connect to the Peace Corps. So that's two things. Well, the first thing is most important, the treaties.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I mean, we live in a world where there's no authority that can enforce anything higher than the nation state. So, we have the UN, we have the World Court, we have the UN Security Council, but they're enforcing treaties is something that the world does not have the capacity to do right now. So, I mean, they're the best that we have. We don't have anything else. If we either work together and honor treaties that we sign, or if they start falling apart, we have nothing left. And that's the biggest danger we have right now in the world, when first the US pulled out of the ABM treaty unilaterally, then we pulled out of the INF treaty unilaterally. That set the stage for Russia to pull out of the New START treaty. I mean, we're just letting things unravel right now, and we have to rebuild that. There's no other alternative. But and we have the examples of the International Court of Justice ordering Israel to stop attacking Rafah. I mean, they just did that a week or two ago, but nobody can enforce it. Unless the U.S. is willing to actually live up to its commitments with regard to the World Court. The U.S. just lets Israel get away with that. And that we have this whole problem of treaties. You're absolutely right, and the U.S. has broken all the treaties that they signed with the Native Americans over the centuries, and many other treaties have been broken. But they are what we have, and although people criticize the Biological Weapons Convention or the Chemical Weapons Convention, there's still chemical weapons out there. There's still landmines being used in Ukraine, for example, even though there's treaties banning these weapons. But there's much less use of these weapons than there were before these treaties. And the interesting thing about some of these treaties is that even though the US doesn't even join some of the treaties, they have pulled back from using these weapons because they know that other countries don't like it and don't accept that it's acceptable. So, for instance, in the first Gulf War with Iraq, the US dropped over 100,000 landmines. And after that, the landmine treaty was signed. They didn't use any in the second Gulf War, in the Iraq War of 2003 on onwards. So these treaties do have an impact. It's limited. We've got to strengthen that, but that's all we have right now. And what was the other question about?
The other thing dealt with the Peace Corps.
Peace Corps, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you're envisaging there, but sure, let's use the Peace Corps. I mean, Biden just launched the Climate Corps, which is a small fragment of what was originally envisaged. But I mean, we need young people out there planting trees. We need young people out there, working to restore wetlands and work with farmers to rebuild, to make more regenerative agriculture. We need so much, we need these people, and we need the government funding to make them happen. And the Peace Corps has a lot of that already built in terms of helping other countries, but it's much broader in its focus, as you probably know. But anyway.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of these treaties, I think that it might be a consideration that WILPF might, or a lot of organizations, a coalition of organizations, because of this phenomenal number of broken treaties, to work to try to develop a coalition that can put some teeth into some of this stuff, because it's outrageous to think about the numbers of treaties that have been broken. I mean, like you said, the whole issue of the ICJ saying stop bombing Gaza, and they just ignored it. So I think that it's almost like a signal to let's do something to put some teeth into the entire structure of stuff to make sure legally. So that's all I wanted to say and put out for consideration because of the history.
Thank
So
you,
thank you
Sheila.
so much.
Hi, everyone. So we have 1 minute left before we have a culture break with a song from our president, Darien De Lu. And Cricket, are you able to phrase your question very briefly?
You want me or Darien? I'll go.
No, Darien will perform in 1 minute.
Okay, I'm going to ask our guests to put into the chat where one could send for the 32-page brochure. And I'd like to make a suggestion that occurred to me when I thought about my family in Canada. And that is, why don't we try to get these brochures, send them to people who have grandchildren or are thinking about grandchildren, and say, here is a good gift you can give the new baby or the 10-year-old or whatever. You're going to work to save their future because it has steps in it, and it's a way, a small thing, you know, you put money into their college fund and you stop the nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Okay, and so thank you very much for coming today, Timmon, Wallis, and Vicki Elson. Awesome presentation, and we will have a culture break as scheduled from our president, Darien De Lu, who will perform for us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Darien De Lu.
Thank you. And I just want to clear how happy I am to follow such a wonderful presentation from Timmon and Vicki. Humor is so important to us. And I do have humorous songs, but I'm not going to sing them today. So I will just launch into my first song, which I think is one suitable to everyone at this gathering. My country left to me protesters' liberty that I may sing. Although first genocide still haunts our every stride, our love of justice is our pride. So let freedom ring. Land where one's energy with opportunity widely combines. True, many have small choice, still each may raise their voice. In our rights we rejoice, so let freedom ring. This far from perfect state has the means to be great if we can join. See how prosperity flows from our unity. No one unless all are free, so let freedom ring. This second song is one I especially want to dedicate to our 98-year-old member in Sacramento. Esther Franklin inspired this song by her work for world governance. There's some who have a special dream of how the world could be, governed by voice of everyone beyond nationality. All in their lands, world citizens would make world policy with respect for the needs of the planet conjoined with human dignity. A global constitution would protect our basic rights, and through global governance, reduce international strife. Come dance with hope, we spin the dream, the earth shall be our ground. Lift up the tools, they're near at hand, beckoning all around. Live fear no more, live out the dream. That's how the world will be, governed by voice of everyone through loving humanity. This song is for our Women, Money, and Democracy Committee especially. And I may only sing part of it. I dreamed I had $10, a crispy single bill. I put it in a bank account. I hope it's waiting still. I paid my monthly charges, $2.50 a special rate. I hope that my $10 is strong enough to wait. Oh yeah, strong enough to wait. It pays for labor and local goods. It pays for commodities. Like river water, it's supposed to flow. We call it currency. We call it currency. I dreamed I had 10,000 bucks all in a bank account. They paid me extra interest, for it was a high amount. I used my monthly earnings, invested at a special rate. I know that my 10,000 will quickly duplicate. Indeed, will quickly duplicate. It pays for labor and local goods. It pays for commodities. Like river water, it's supposed to flow. We call it currency. We call it currency. I dreamed I owned a banking house that issued dollar notes. They called it legal tender. See how well it floats. I gathered people's savings and loaned them 5 times out. How I enjoyed increasing returns, I dare not tell about. Oh no, I dare not tell about. It pays for labor and local goods. It pays for commodities. Like river water, it's supposed to flow. We call it currency. We call it currency. I woke from all my dreaming, as troubled as can be. You know I own no banking house, so what brings wealth to me? If wealth resides in banknotes, where can its value be? I wonder if we can bring value back with a local currency. Why not a local currency? It pays for labor and local goods. It pays for commodities. Like river water, it's supposed to flow. We call it currency. Oh yeah, we call it currency. And I just want to remind other people, you may or may not have much of a singing voice. We can all sing. And we can all write words to songs or tunes to songs and get together and have empowered speech through the singing of our songs. I'm delighted to come right before Osprey Orielle Lake because I love the transition that WILPF is making from our last Congress in 2021 when we were celebrating ICAN and the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And now we're celebrating WECAN. So thank you.
Thank you, Darien. And now we will have a brief video from our development committee. And then we will move into our next part of the schedule, which is a presentation from the WILPF U.S. Issue Committee, Advancing Human Rights.
Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. Section. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. Section. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. Section. Peace now, freedom now, peace now, freedom now. Give now, today. Give now, today. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. Section. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. Section. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. Section.
Thank you very much for sharing that video with us all, Cheryl. And I need to make a correction. We have an interview with Osprey Orielle Lake, facilitated by Laura Dewey up next. So please begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. I'm really pleased to be speaking here today with Osprey Orielle Lake. She is the founder and executive director of WECAN, Women's Earth and Climate Action Network International. She also serves on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. And the rights of nature is one of many topics addressed in her new book, The Story is in Our Bones: How Worldview and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. In this beautiful work, Osprey highlights stories of women who are struggling for environmental justice around the world, sometimes using indigenous knowledge going back to 5,000 years. Osprey writes for The Guardian, Common Dreams, The Ecologist, and other publications, and lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Osprey, to the WILPF Congress. We're delighted that you could be with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
And now we're going to show a video. Osprey, did you want to introduce this video?
Sure. So I wanted to start, as stated, I am the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN. And I know we're going to be discussing my book today, The Story is in Our Bones, as you said, and also some of the work that we're doing at WECAN, which is an organization that is based on rights and also how we can really move forward an agenda that has a feminist lens and uplifts Indigenous, Black, and Brown women from all over the world. And we have a variety of projects that we do, which I'm sure we'll get into in a moment. But I thought it would be really helpful to start this session by sharing a little video that we produced when we came out of the climate negotiations that were held in Dubai at the end of last year. As some of you, I'm sure, know, there's the UN climate talks that happen on an annual basis. And a lot of the frontline women leaders that we usually bring with us so that they can advocate for themselves and talk to governments directly, and we can help lift up their agendas, were with us in Dubai. And so I thought we would share this video to get a sense of our network and the work that we're doing in the world. And so that's why I wanted to share this video. So let's go ahead and see that, and then we can continue the interview.
How will the future generation look back on us? Are they going to say that we were the healers? We were the warriors that stood up for them so that they may live.
In this time of colliding crises and failing infrastructures, worsening climate disasters, I do believe we have a time to act, to ensure a fast, fair, and equitable phase out, and ensure a planet for current and future generations.
A recent report by the UN Environment Program found that governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than what would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Since the signing of the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest private banks have provided $5.5 trillion in financing to the fossil fuel industry. We cannot continue with these disastrous numbers.
The fossil fuel industry has hurt us for far too long, both in the terms of emissions, but also causing a lot of wars and militarization.
And when we talk about the impacts of oil and gas and why we need a phase out of oil and gas all across the globe, is because this is not just about the reduction of emissions at source. This is also about the reductions of the harms and the violence Indigenous peoples have felt on our lands and our bodies and our communities.
It's crystal clear. We need a concrete, binding plan to end the expansion of new coal, oil, and gas projects and manage a transition away from fossil fuels. Nation states are now calling for a fossil fuel treaty, an equitable and wind-down plan for how to manage the wind-down in a way that leaves no country or community behind.
Polluters out! Polluters out! Polluters out! No climate justice without human rights! No climate justice without human rights! No climate justice without human rights!
Nós, mulheres, precisamos continuar avançando juntas. E juntas estamos aqui também para apresentar soluções.
Whether it's on the front lines of resistance to fossil fuels, protecting and replanting forests, creating food sovereignty networks, or advocating for transformative climate policies, women are leading the way. It is code red for humanity, and we're drawing a red line to say no more to sacrifice people and no more to sacrifice zones.
We need to decolonize these spaces because, if the planet is still alive, it's because we, the women, are taking care of our lands.
The message is quite clear. Feminists, frontline activists, frontline women, Indigenous people have long had the solutions, are advocating for these year in, year out, and it is time we heed to their leadership because we have long run out of time.
E viemos fazer clamor. Não há possibilidade de barrar as mudanças climáticas sem considerar os territórios como solução número 1. Pela terra, pelas águas, pela floresta de pé, não podemos derramar sangue indígena no chão.
We're enacting things in the Ponca territory like the rights of nature because we know that we as human beings are not separate from nature. But at this moment, we are nature protecting itself.
Thank you for that inspiring video.
My to-do list.
No, it didn't. So Osprey, let's dive in.
Showing up.
So let's dive into a theme covered in your book and also on the WECAN website. The website poses the question why women, and it answers it in short, and you elaborate on the answer in your question in your book. So please just tell us why women.
Well, I think that it's really important to understand, going upstream a little bit, which is that the current moment we're in, as many scholars are calling it, is a polycrisis. And we're talking about an economic crisis, a social crisis, a gender crisis, a climate crisis, an environmental crisis, a colonization crisis, and I could go on. And I think one of the root causes that we're looking at of why we're in these multiple crises is the fact of gender inequality. And so when we look at the climate crisis and environmental degradation, because of gender inequality around the world, we see that women and gender diverse leaders and peoples are impacted first and worst because of so many unjust social structures that leave women much more vulnerable when crises happen. And so we have a lot of statistics on how that happens, whether it's that they don't have the capacity to care for their families in a crisis and they're the main caretakers in their home, or even in some countries where they're not allowed to learn how to swim and can't do anything if there's a flood and can't protect themselves or care for themselves. So this impacts women much more seriously than any other community. At the same time, when we look at solutions, which is something that a lot of governments are just beginning to realize, is that we actually can't get to sustainability and to solutions and to an equitable world without involving women's leadership. And I'll just give some reference points, because I think it's important to understand that we might think ethically we should live in egalitarian societies, and we know lifting up the feminine women principles is really important right now, but it actually is essential. So WECAN was involved in something called the Scenarios Forum, which is a body of researchers that feeds the IPCC reports, which is critical to the climate negotiations and how governments are looking at the climate crisis. And I shared there a study that shows that with just a 1 unit increase in something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which is an index that all countries have, and research is done on all the countries. And it's basically what kind of political power women have in any particular country, what kind of social agencies do they have, are their voices heard, are they being given equal pay, these sorts of things. And with just a 1 unit increase in the Women's Political Empowerment Index, we see an 11.51 degree decrease in carbon emission reductions. So 11.51% is really large, to figure out some way to really get at large reductions in emissions. And it's not all about the climate crisis and resolving things so that we don't have, so we can stop the worst impacts of the climate crisis. It's not all about carbon emission reductions, certainly, but seeing just this indicator of the role of women's empowerment and how that can impact how we're navigating the climate crisis, I think is really important. And at the grassroots level, between 40 and 80% of all household food production in developing countries is done by women. And I could go on and on about different stats, but I just wanted to say that, we have to look at the role of gender when we're looking at addressing global crises. We also saw this, just as an example, in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are many stories that show that countries that were led by women did far better navigating their populations through the COVID-19 pandemic than men. And it's not about putting men down, but rather lifting women up and really striving for an egalitarian governance framework, which we're really missing. And so this is why we're centering women. And the last piece I'll say on this is that at WECAN, we also recognize that it's not possible to have a gender lens without also incorporating a racial lens, because it's also true that Indigenous, Black, and Brown women are impacted even more because of race, and also have specific solutions that are critical right now to all of us. And so I think we have to really always talk about race when we talk about gender as well.
When you mentioned, women being in parliament, things happen. It reminded me of after that terrible mass shooting of a mosque in New Zealand. And the prime minister, and they worked with the government, immediately banned automatic rifles. Amazing, yeah. In your book, you describe several worldviews, and I think this is a big focus of your book, is that there are different worldviews out there, contrary to the ones that we experience here in this country. It struck me that there are two worldviews behind two different tree planting projects. There was one that WECAN has been doing through Women for Forests program, in the Itambwe rainforest in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Then there's another kind of tree planting program that on the face of it sounds good. We plant trees in the name of carbon offsetting. And so can you talk about these two kinds of reforesting in the context of worldviews?
Sure. Well, thank you for pulling out those examples from the book. So just to say that one of the reasons that I focused on worldviews in the book is because at WECAN, we're very involved in tree planting and going to the climate negotiations and working to stop fossil fuel projects to protect water and the climate. And, there's a lot of practical work that we do every day to put out, these emergency fires in the Amazon, to the DR Congo, to different countries in the world. But, let's say I could wave a magical wand and end the climate crisis tomorrow. The fact is we would still have these systems in place of environmental racism, of extractive economies, and this worldview that from the dominant society, that we have dominion over nature, that men have dominion over women, that humans have dominion over nature, that white people are more important than other people, and all of these hierarchical structures are incredibly detrimental to the earth and to one another. And so the book really gets into how do we look at root causes, which brings us to a question around worldviews and what are our worldviews, and how do we actually dismantle the ones that are harmful and rebuild different social structures and views, worldviews and paradigms and ideologies that really bring us to being a life-enhancing species living in harmony with one another and the land. And so this is sort of the context of which then I would talk about these forest programs, because the project we're doing in the DR Congo involves over 1,000 women now. And I'm sure many know that it's a region, unfortunately, that has a great deal of violence because of conflict. Well, what is that conflict based on? The conflict has a lot to do with white supremacy. The conflict has a lot to do with the fact of all of the minerals under the ground in the DR Congo that are needed for this transition off of fossil fuels to clean energy. But we have to look at how is that being done. And also the region is really rich in forest. It's the Congo Basin. And the Congo Basin is only second to the Amazon rainforest in terms of where we have these incredible forests that are sequestering carbon, which is key to climate mitigation. And so the project we're engaged in is both to reforest damaged lands through, again, because of colonization and the impact on these communities that live there, indigenous peoples that live in the DR Congo. There's been a lot of deforestation and slash and burn techniques for from the agro business and many other factors that have decimated large areas of what were, pristine forests. And so 25% of the trees that we're planting right now go back to human use for communities who live there. And 75% of the trees we're planting there go back to reforesting and rewilding the land. And so it's a way to regenerate and heal the land. But as we've been in this project for over 8 years now, it's very exciting because we're actually growing enough trees that we're almost to the point where the local populations don't need to go into the old growth forest and cut down trees there for their needs. So we're also protecting 1.6 million acres of old growth forest while we regenerate all this new forest land. And it's helping the women because they're now able to grow trees close to their homes and not go into the forest where they get attacked often because of these conflicts. So it's helping the women, it's empowering the women in a very patriarchal society to have their own income and have stature in their community. So it's also really interesting culturally what's happening with this project. And we've also grown a lot of food because, of course, people need food when there's conflict. So it's also a food security program as well. So it's a whole way of looking holistically at how do we lift up women's leadership? How do we regenerate forest? How do we protect old growth forests and create these new models that are really regenerative and healing and have a different ideology behind them? So going to the other model that you talked about, what's happening a lot in terms of the continuation of the idea of these systems of oppression that are impacting us, meaning, just to name them explicitly, patriarchy, colonization, racism, and extractive economies, and in our modern day context, capitalism, is that as the world starts wrestling with what we're going to do about the climate crisis, there's a lot of impulse by the wealthy elite, by corporations, to continue business as usual. And so they come up with all of these different mechanisms. Carbon offsets that you mentioned are one of them. And this is the idea that a fossil fuel company or any company that's generating pollution continues to pollute. And if they're generating carbon emissions, what they can do is then buy carbon credits from some other place and continue to pollute while they get, their carbon emissions, quote unquote, offset. So this means that they'll go to some place where there are forests and contribute funds to protect that forest. And you have to understand the sort of shell game that's going on here, because truly, one, they're not stopping pollution at all, because we should be stopping pollution at the source, not offsetting someplace else. And then the offset also is not very real, because those forests are already generating sequestering carbon. They were doing that before the offset happened, and that forest was already intact. It also can lead to a lot of damage to the communities, because sometimes what governments will do is remove Indigenous peoples from their territories, or their forest territories, or forest lands. That is their right to be there. And so it can be very destructive to local populations and Indigenous peoples and create rights violations. And then on top of that, last year, one of the companies that was generated to monitor carbon offsets, called Vera, I put this in the book, found that 90% of the carbon offsets were false. They weren't even real. And so, not only is it not working, not only is it scientifically ill-based, it also just continues the models we're in. Instead of understanding how we're living is not working, and we need to change who we are and how we live, and change our policies, and stop over consumerism, and really start looking at very different models of what are our societal frameworks. Business as usual is continuing to be pushed by the wealthy elite and governments. And that's what we really need to get at, is take a much deeper dive into root causes, and a deeper dive into how do we transform our businesses, how we transform how we're living. And that's what we really need to get at.
I couldn't agree with you more on all of this. Want to get to a story. You tell many stories of women working in their land and communities, all the way from Ecuador to New Orleans to Chad, Fiji, and India. And you tell so many of these stories, you intersperse them throughout the book. And you mentioned that many have died for their cause. And, their persistence is exemplified, I think, in a refrain that you heard at a tribute to Berta Caceres, if I'm saying her name correctly, the Honduran environmentalist who was murdered in 2016. Yeah, you can say it better than I. Okay. And what they said at her tribute was, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. And I thought that was a brilliant formulation of women activism. So tell us one of those inspiring stories, and perhaps even the worldview that outlines it, or that underlines it.
Well, I'm really inspired by so many powerful women from around the world who are on the front lines of the climate crisis and doing everything they can to stop the worst of the impacts. And in that section of the book, I'm also sharing about a lot of the women from the Amazon in Ecuador. We work with Indigenous women leaders in the Ecuadorian and Brazilian Amazon. And in this particular section of the book, I'm talking about some really brilliant Indigenous leaders from the Sariaco community. They are Quechua women, and they have done a remarkable work. They do remarkable work to protect their forest homelands. And one of the things that I really love about this community, the entire community, is the something called the Living Forest Declaration or the Living Forest Proposal. And it's an Indigenous worldview and an Indigenous proposal about how to protect forests. And I really love this because the Sariaku community came together and said, you know, we keep getting all of these frameworks from our own government, and then we go to global international forums and conferences. We're always being told by the dominant society how we should manage our forests and what is, you know, Western worldviews on forest management. And clearly, you all don't know what you're doing, or you wouldn't be destroying the forest. So why don't you listen to how we as an Indigenous people view our forest and how we have managed it for millennium and protected it? And I think in context, it's important to say that 80% of all biodiversity left on Earth, 80%, our forests, our waters, the wildlife is in the hands and territories of Indigenous peoples. It's being stewarded by Indigenous peoples. So even though they constitute only 4% of the world population, 80% of the biodiversity they're stewarding. So I think it's long past time that we really listen to Indigenous peoples and understand their worldview, their ideologies, their concepts, and their practices, their traditional ecological practices around how to care for land and how to respect the living earth. And so this declaration is just extraordinary. And I share some of it in the book. And there's more that can be found online by looking up the Living Forest Declaration. In their language, it's called Kalsaksacha. And it's very holistic. It has very practical concepts about how to care for the forest, but also a deep dive into how they view all the different living beings in the forest and the spirits of the forest. So it is ecological, it's political, it's environmental, and social and spiritual all at once. It's very holistic. And I think that's something that we all need to really learn from, because I think one of the things that we're really wrestling with in our dominant worldview, in the dominant society, is this idea that, that the earth is not alive, that we're not part of nature, that we are separate from nature. And I think that as a worldview has been incredibly detrimental at the deepest levels of our being, not in terms of only how we feel like we're orphaned from the land and community, but also the trauma that causes and the violence that it causes when you don't feel you belong and you're not connected to the web of life. So I think it has many, many, many ramifications that we're experiencing in our current context. And I think one of the things we can learn from this Living Forest Declaration from the Sariaco people is this view of living in an earth lineage, in an animate cosmology, living in a cosmology in which the world is alive. And it's so much happier and healthier for us than our current context in which we separate out our spirituality from our economy, from how we live and how we view being a species on this planet. And so I think that's something that has really inspired me. And the women are really amazing. I'll end with a forest program we're doing with them that we just started at the end of last year, excuse me, and are implementing now, which is Patricia Gualinga, who's a coordinator, a WECAN coordinator who is Quechua living in the Sariaco community. She let us know that some of the trees in the Ecuadorian Amazon are going extinct. And this is due to some of the extractive industries, whether it's oil and mining in Ecuador, and also due just to the fact of the changing climate. And so we're working together to through women's networks to collect a lot of these seeds in very far regions of the jungle and of the seeds that are of the trees that are going extinct, and creating nurseries. And then we're going to, this coming year, be planting these trees back into the forest so that we protect these trees and bring them back into the forest, because one, they have ecological integrity that is very important to the forest, but also cultural and spiritual significance. So this is just like one idea of how do we become a life-enhancing species? How do we work with the land? And so this is something that has really inspired me from working with the women there.
When you just said something about working with the land, you reminded me of something that you wrote in the book about us being a keystone species. I have to admit, I was a little surprised about this concept, that human beings are a keystone species. And for those who don't know, my rough understanding is that a keystone species is an animal, a living being that without which the others would not survive. And I used to think, well, if human beings are wiped off the earth, it'd be good for the rest of the life. So since you touched on them caring for the earth, what is our role as a keystone species, and what is that? And also you mentioned too that years ago, thousands of years ago, people had an impact on the environment, but they were caretakers of the environment. They were not passive caretakers. They didn't re-engineer it to destroy it. They re-engineered it to help humans and other animals. So if you could touch on that whole concept of being a keystone species, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I mean, we're certainly not acting that way now. And if there were no humans on the earth would be flourishing just fine. Just to be clear, we're not a necessary keystone species, but we could be one. And I think it's really important to highlight that. And there's a wonderful Indigenous leader, her name is Lila June Johnson, who wrote an entire PhD thesis on this topic of Indigenous peoples and how they cared for the land. And there's another author I really love, Kat Anderson, who wrote a book on tending the wild. And what's important about this is that Indigenous peoples for millennium, and when I say Indigenous people, I think it's important to make some distinctions. One, mostly I'm talking about current day Indigenous peoples and how they're living with the land in contrast to Western society or the dominant culture. But it's also important to remember that at some point, all of us have come from Indigenous peoples, whether it's thousands of years ago before colonization, that we can also tap into our own Indigenous roots. And how to do that is not necessarily easy. It takes a lot of research and learning and maybe going to different places and remembering old time stories in our families. There's lots of ways to get involved in this work of ancestral research. But I mentioned that because also to remember that, I'm mostly talking about intact Indigenous peoples today, but, our ancestors, if they're from Europe, also have practices of, having land commons, all these different ideas about how to live with the land in a mutually enhancing manner. And so the idea of keystone species is that, when, just to use the example of the United States, when all the European settlers first came here, they called the land wild, that they were out in the wilderness. And it's really a false concept because that land, every ounce of it, all the land here in the United States was tended to by Indigenous peoples, but in such a way that is so embedded in nature that to the eye that's untrained, it looks just wild. So what does this mean? It means like areas where, the women would go to collect their plants for making baskets. They would make sure that certain areas they planted certain willows and different kinds of plants so they could grow straight and tall, which were certain kinds of willows needed for the kind of baskets they were making. But if you looked at the land, you would just see a big wild willow patch, quote unquote wild, but it actually had been tended and planted. Or in other areas here in California and other regions, I'm most familiar with California, but they would have these burns in the forests that were controlled burns. And one, it would keep the tinder down so that when the fires came through, they didn't destroy the entire forest because it wasn't a tinderbox. But also it opened up areas that would allow for the animals to come in and forage and, it helped the entire ecosystem, these controlled burns. And in fact, as the climate crisis worsens and there's more and more forest fires out here on the West Coast, finally, the Forest Service is beginning to recognize that we need to go back to some of these practices of Indigenous peoples to keep the tinder down and have these planned burns that are controlled so that when the fires come through, they won't destroy the entire forest. So a lot of Indigenous peoples are being invited back into forest management, not at the scale needed. There's so much more could be said about that. But just to say that, there has been example after example about how to live in harmony with nature that both cares for nature and for humans in a way that everyone survives in the best way in the web of life. And so this is like a different idea, certainly, than how we're living now, which is a very extractive, one-way sort of mode of conduct with nature, which is, again, from this ideology and worldview that we have dominion over nature, that nature's here to be our slave and to give us everything we want without practicing reciprocity, without practicing a reciprocal respect for nature. And clearly it's not working. And so I think we really need to understand a very different concept of how we need to be relating to the land.
Thank you. I think we had time for one more question, then we'll go to Q&A. This question is a two-parter and rather long, but as you know, the next COP meeting, COP 29, is coming up in Azerbaijan in, I think, November. And WILPF International will be sending delegates to COP 29. And because WILPF is an NGO and has standing in the United Nations and has consultative status also with the UN Economic and Social Council. So what can WILPF do to build support for COP 29 and the Fossil Fuel Treaty? That's part one. The other part is about activism also. And what campaigns or actions do you think WILPF should be working on? What kind of strategies and tactics are other organizations engaging in? And what coalitions are forming in this period of time?
Do we have 4 hours to discuss this? Very big question. That's a lot. So I'll just do a few highlights because that's a wonderful question. And I'm thrilled to hear that you're going to be there and thrilled to know that you're looking strategically at, what can be accomplished. I mean, I do think I'll mention a couple of things. One is that this is going to be the COP that's focusing on climate finance. And so I think we really need to talk about many different areas of climate finance. And, just since we're talking about women, the fact that women's organizations who are working at the nexus of climate and the environment are completely underfunded. And, so we need to be demanding more climate finance for women leaders who are actually doing work on the ground, these communities who are protecting forests, who are providing food security. Women-led organizations are essential, and we need to be demanding, gender responsive climate finance. I think that, we will continue to work for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. WECAN is on the steering committee of the treaty. And in short, in case people don't know, we need the Paris Climate Agreement because it did bring all governments together to decide that we would work collectively as a global community to fight the climate crisis. But it is woefully short on so many things and inadequate. And one of the things it doesn't address is the need to look at the supply end of the climate crisis, which is fossil fuels. It mostly focuses on carbon emission reductions, which allows for business as usual to continue because it's not actually talking about the source. And the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is based on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we know that these kind of international treaties can work. And it's basically demanding that governments have a mechanism that will allow them to specifically negotiate on ending fossil fuels. And there's already 12 countries that have endorsed the treaty, which is really exciting. And what was really powerful at the COP in Dubai last year is that Colombia endorsed during the climate negotiations. And that's really important because Colombia is a fossil fuel producing country. And there's been incredible leadership from island nations who've always pushed the most at the negotiations as climate vulnerable countries to have the most bold and transformative negotiations possible. So I'd be looking for that. We are also always bringing the framework of rights of nature with us to these climate talks because rights of nature brings a framework in which we look at nature as a rights-bearing entity. And again, that could be a long conversation, so I'll just leave it at that. But we need to look at a different way of centering the Earth into a rights-based approach to the climate crisis and environmental degradation. There's a lot at stake around something called Article 6, which is promoting market-based mechanisms, like we talked about offsets. So we're going to be spending a lot of time in the negotiating rooms around Article 6, because it could easily leave out human rights, Indigenous rights, gender responsive climate policies, ecological integrity. So Article 6 is a very, very worrying part of the negotiations that needs to be monitored. And right now, actually, people are gathering in Bonn for the intersessional before the climate talks and at the end of the year. And Article 6 is going to be really hashed out more in more detail during the Bonn intersessional. And then also something that I think is interesting is the Just Transition Working Group, which we're a part of. And what are we talking about with a just transition? What does that look like? And governments are now meeting around this. It's newly established. And I think there's a real opening in the Just Transition Working Program for different ideas to be presented. Feminist economics, looking at decarbonizing the economy. What does it mean to, again, have a rights-based approach? So it's an area we can push and advocate in. I still think that there'll be space there'll be a lot of organizing. For those of you who were following the negotiations last year, there were a lot of pro-Palestinian protests, since we were there with governments, and really connecting the dots between militarization, the climate crisis, and human rights, and really talking about how there is no climate justice without human rights. And I think those connections will continue to be had when we are in Azerbaijan. And I think I'm going to leave it there because it's so wide ranging what could be done. But every year we bring frontline women to the negotiations, and we'll be doing that again. And look forward to figuring out other ways to collaborate.
Thank you. As you said earlier, we're experiencing a poly crisis, and we need poly solutions for sure. So, okay, we'll go to questions. I see one hand. Alan, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. This is a beautiful presentation. And what I wanted to, as you projected a keystone species possibly, it seems to me the keystone question is, in all of this, how do we reclaim the commons that has been sequestered by the private interests in the government for their extractive purposes? And the commons is that where the resources are self-managed by the people. And that's what that is a traditional way, and it's very much the struggle for in the water purification and quality also. So I think that the common question as to whether we are going to be this keystone species is whether we can engage the struggle for the commons that has been taken away from people, since states and power organized itself around war and patriarchy and command and hierarchy. And this redressing the gender imbalance is very much at the forefront of any change that's going to happen, because the war system is a patriarchal system of domination. Full spectrum domination is what the Pentagon calls their vision. And we need quite the opposite, the old way, which is full spectrum cooperation. We're all in this together. We're all kin, all the species and living stuff. So I love everything you said, and it's most beautiful. And it is reclaiming the commons. I think that's the keystone question. If humanity is going to have a positive influence in the tremendously terrible direction things are going. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Do I see any more questions? I don't see any in the chat. Any hands?
Not currently.
Okay, we have Sherry. Sherry, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Miigwech, thank you again. I'm humbled to be here. I could have a lot of questions, and we're here because of the AAA. So what came to me was, since we're in such a brilliant room, and I'm humbled to be here, what if we began an action? Let's say on the day of summer solstice, we use this treaty to end fossil fuels and we blow up social media worldwide. And then through indigenous-led guidance, we continue that on for 3 more days. So that would be 4 days of just blowing up social media worldwide. Because then now we're in a ceremony, right? And we've taken over the spirit that we believe exists in this technology as well. And then through that action, we can also direct people to the nuclear treaty, the UN, COP29, and everything else. I may be way off table here, but I apologize, that's what came to me.
No need to apologize, Sherry. Thank you so much for that wonderful idea. And yeah, that's exactly it. You know, people get inspired and this is it, you know, like it's in our own hands. So I think all ideas are wonderful. And I really appreciate you mentioning that, Sherry. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful initiative, you know, how to organize and take action and bring awareness. All those things are so important. Thank you.
Darien? You're muted.
Thank you. I wonder, Osprey, you talk about those of us who especially are from European backgrounds, finding out about our indigenous roots and embracing those. I am sure you're aware that there's a sort of neo-pagan movement out there, some of which has relied on cultural appropriation, but other parts of which are more specifically related to actual European traditions. And do you think that is one legitimate way for people to reconnect with an indigenous worldview? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, you know, reconnecting with our own ancestral roots can't substitute for like immediate actions of, you know, stopping a fossil fuel project or protecting our communities if the water is being harmed. I mean, we need to kind of do many things at once, in my perspective. So, you know, we need to listen to indigenous peoples who are caring for their lands now and protect their rights and territories with them and ask them what they need and listen to them and listen to their calls for land back. We need to go to these negotiations and fight for our communities, all of these things. And we also need to heal and transform, because otherwise we're just going to perpetuate these old systems. And so this is where this internal work is essential. And so I would just point out a few pieces of that, which is, you know, how do we find out, you know, research can be done. There's books and books written about it. And in my book, The Stories in Our Bones, you know, I lay out a lot of this roadmap of the journey I've been on to go find out about my own ancestors, to hear stories from my family and begin to reweave this broken tapestry. And how do we actually bring the threads back together and reweave our histories? Because that brings us, if we keep going, even, you know, beyond just our immediate, like last few generations family tree, we can go back to what I call our pre-colonized, pre-patriarchal roots. And this is essential because we can actually learn from our far back ancestors. And why this is important is it has changed me personally, but it's also changed how I view how we can live with the land, because we did come from a people before they were colonized, before the feminine was cast down. And we had lived in egalitarian societies, and they weren't all perfect. Of course, we're human beings, we're filled with foibles, but the basic foundation of being, you know, that we respect rights, that we respect the land, that we connect with nature, that we are part and particle of nature, not separate, changes us to being people who are living in an animate cosmology, which means you don't harm your Mother Earth. You don't harm one another because you realize we're all connected. And when we don't have that and we forget we're part of the Earth lineage, which we're all, again, part of when we go back to our ancestral roots, then we don't have those stories. We don't have that connection. And I think this creates enormous violence because there's an emptiness, and whether that emptiness is filled with consumerism, over extractivism, harming others, othering, all of these violences come from not belonging. And we have to retrieve that belonging. It's essential to the core of us as human beings. And even if it's just one song from our ancestors or one practice of reciprocity, which I share some of these in my book, then we can begin to heal. And when we heal, we will not enact such oppression and violence, because this is also the root of white supremacy, this clinging on to an identity when you don't feel you belong. And yeah, I spent 400 pages in the book going through this, so I'm not going to go into it fully, but I think you sort of get the sense of this. But I think we all need to begin this healing process and remembering process. And then it'll create a different sense of generosity and confidence in our presence as a modern day society, which will be healthy for everyone. And this is something I think we're in the process of doing, and it's a transformative political action. I would even say it is part of our politic to do it.
I just want to give a shout out to Starhawk and the Reclaiming Collective, which as a part of the neo-pagan movement has integrated the earth-based spirituality with political activism, going to the COPs and to other significant occasions like the World Trade Organization would-be expansion that was quashed, at least for a while. Thank you.
Thanks, Darien. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Randy and then Lucille. Go ahead, Randy.
For me, it's the LGBTQ community. You were talking about oppression. I think a lot of people don't understand the community, where we're from, who we are, how long our history has been around. I noticed that. I read your book, by the way. And my question was, how do we get other communities involved in the same fight that you're involved in? African American community has also been oppressed. Men and women, LGBTQI community has been oppressed. And I'm just curious about, and like I said, I saw your book about this, but I didn't see how we were going to get others involved in this, because all oppressed groups should get involved.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that one of the things that can pull us together and bring us together, as you asked, is when we recognize that we're all fighting the same systems of oppression. And it's not even, we're all fighting the same system of oppression. It's not even for the LGBTQI community or the Black community or Indigenous peoples or brown peoples. I mean, we're not fighting it equally, but it's important to recognize that we're all fighting these same systems of racism, patriarchy, colonization, and capitalism. Like we're all dealing with this conundrum and this the water that we're swimming in a society right now. And I think once we recognize that we all have a stake in this, that we can't just lift our own boats, we have to lift all boats at the same time, because they're all intersectional, they're all intertwined. If as the saying goes, if someone is not free, we are all not free, is true. And the other thing that I like to think of it as is that if we look at the basic principles of human rights, collectively, we're all really trying to just be human beings on the planet allowed to live, whether we're from Palestine, whether we're LGBTQI, whether we're, whatever background we're from, why are we struggling so hard just to live a decent life? This should not be our condition. And this we all can collectively organize around. And how we need to intervene with the wealthy elite and the corporations that are not being accountable for these violations of human rights, however they look. And so I think this is how we can connect together, is that we are not going to make it unless we have coalitions that are, where unions can be involved, where everyone from society can be involved. And I think that a lot of the climate justice movement recognizes that. And we do work collectively, and we need to do it more.
Okay, thank you. We have time, just barely enough time for one more question. We'll have to make it quick. Lucille, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your work, which I'm not familiar with. And so my question is, and maybe you can point me in your work that you do address it, is I really appreciate the root causes focus of yours, and I just want to know whether, and if so, to what extent you've looked at sort of the systemic underpinning of capitalism, of our political economy in our monetary system, in our private debt-based interest-bearing money system. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think that's a really great question. And it's absolutely the case that, the different instruments of capitalism continue to perpetuate the system, and including debt, and how, as an example, we create, as the United States, we go into countries, we extract things from them, and then we harm the communities that have been extracted from, and then to help them get out of the situation that was forced upon them, then we make them go into debt to get the money to fix their communities that were destroyed. And so it's very unfortunate that the entire economic framework we're operating under continues to create ecological problems and social harms. And so, because I know I have to keep this short, I go into this in great detail in the book. There's a whole section on how do we have an economy that's reciprocal, looking at ideas of beyond growth or degrowth. How do we move out of GDP? All these ways that we can begin to address moving out of an extractive economy. And I don't think I have time to go further than that, but I think that there are models, the donut economics. So I go into great detail in the books about economy and how do we move ourselves into a new economy that is based on planetary boundaries and also respects human rights and the land. So I think I'll have to just leave it at that. But yes, it's a critical point on that. We have to deal with the frameworks of our economic structures, or we can't do all the things that we want. It's part of the puzzle that has to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a bit of a teaser. Now we're going to read the book to find out your complete answer. But thank you so much for attending this present, bringing us, teaching us more about this issue, and we're delighted to have had you here. So thank you so much. And I have to hand it over to, I think, the next person, or Dee.